Well, hello book besties, welcome back to my channel. My name is Liv if you're new here, and today we are going to be chatting about the books I read in the month of March. Different angle, and honestly there's no big rhyme or reason for that other than the fact that I just wanted to sit in a comfier chair in a comfier position. Plus, who doesn't love a little bit of a fresh take? I feel like I'm always filming in the same exact spot, so hopefully this isn't too distracting. You can see a little bit more of my rainbow shelves, and honestly just makes me really happy. But besides that, we are here to chat about the books that I read in the month of March. And March, I will say, was a pretty good reading month in terms of number. I read 9 books, but I will say my average rating was lower than 4, so that's a little bit disappointing. I did have a 2-star that I honestly wasn't expecting. Most of these books I did vlog or have in videos, and I feel like there's just gonna be a lot of overlap with doing weekly vlogs now, but I know you guys have basically been begging me to do wrap-ups again this year, so I'm here to give the people what they want, although I will say there's probably gonna be a lot of repetitive books. But in case you haven't watched any of my other videos and you just want my opinion on a certain book in this video, here we are. I'm here to wrap up what I read in the month of March, so let's just go ahead and dive in. I have my handy dandy reading journal here to give you guys my stats. Like I said, I read a total of 9 books with an average of 3.66, which is a lot lower than I was hoping for, especially for reading 9 books. Definitely was not like my best average rating, but I still ended up reading 3,033 pages, which I believe was more than January, but still less than February. Even though I read mostly mystery thrillers, I will say I did read a good variety. I read romance, mystery thrillers, fantasy, a manga, and a graphic novel, and typically that doesn't happen, and hopefully in the future I want to do that more, especially with manga and graphic novels. They're like my favorite medium or media way to intake books, and I would love to do what I kind of started doing near the end of March, which is every weekend to pick a graphic novel or manga or both and read those. I feel like it was just such a good palate cleanser to break up all my other books, so I'm hoping to do that a lot more in the coming months. But let's just go ahead and get into it, starting with the 2 fantasy books that I read this month. So the first book that I read for my Tea Time Society book club over on Patreon was Powerless. And let me just say, I wanted to like this a lot more than I did. I actually ended up giving this one only 3 stars, and that was kind of like a huge plot twist for me because I was seeing so much hype around this. The overall Goodreads rating is like 4.0 or over, and I was like, okay, wow, this is going to be a phenomenal book. It's probably gonna be one of my favorites of the year, and I was sorely mistaken. I honestly don't know if it's because I've been reading The Hunger Games as a read-along on Patreon, and then I also read this, so I read them very close together. There are way too similarities with the reaping, and our main character in this book has like a younger sister or a younger friend. There was even like a cave scene. There was just way too many similarities, and it ended up taking me out of the story. I mean, we even have this mentor lady that acts like Effie Trinket, and I'm like, what in the world? I just felt like I was reading fanfic the whole time, and as one of the biggest Hunger Games fans ever, I just couldn't get with this. But I also felt like it didn't deserve a 2-star. The main male interest in this book used the word darling every single time he talked to the female lead. I was like, are you serious? I personally don't mind that term. It's never anything that's bothered me until this book, and I never want to hear that word again. Essentially, this is like Hunger Games, but make it magic. There are people that have magical abilities, and they're kind of thrown into this arena, but you also have the other side of this where there's kings and queens, and there's even balls, which gave me like Hunger Games Regency vibes. But what I also didn't quite grasp was the Hunger Games like reapings. I forget what they even called it in the book. I can only think of the Hunger Games. But basically they have to fight each other to the death, but they were thrown back into the arena multiple times, and I don't even know how the characters got there. I feel like there was just a lot of plot holes, and you can definitely tell this was a debut book. Not a terrible thing. I think this is very well written for it being a debut, but honestly, it just reminded me of way too many other books, and I don't know if I'm gonna pick up the second one. Honestly, I might end up passing, but there was a lot of people that did really like it in my book club, and honestly, I was scrambling to finish this before book club, and I feel like I didn't catch a lot of the details because I just wanted it to be over. But what I did really love is the pacing was great, and the ending with the cliffhanger, I thought that was a really good twist. So that is what's piquing my interest to actually pick up the second book, but I feel like I could have done without the first 3/4 of the book. So with that being said, I don't know how to feel about this one. It was just average for me, so I decided to land on a 3-star. The next fantasy book that I read, which I did rate a little bit lower than I thought I would because I started this one having the biggest 5-star feeling, that is A Fate Inked in Blood by Danielle L. Jensen. This book right here deserves a 5-star just for the cover design and the sprayed edges. Literally so amazing. This is an adult romantasy book, but think of Vikings and gods, and I loved that idea going into this. The narration was absolutely phenomenal. The accents were very thick, but it really brought this story to life. Essentially, we have Freya, who is this shield maiden who has always hidden her powers until one day she gets super angry with the man that she's basically betrothed to. She ends up being betrothed to another guy who treats her very poorly because he finds out that she has these powers, and he is determined to control her and win this war because of her powers. But then we have his son Bjorn, who ends up kind of wreaking havoc, and she ends up falling in love with him. There's war, there's magic, but honestly what really hooked me from the beginning is the crazy amount of things that happen from chapter 1. I could not stop reading. Basically every chapter is a cliffhanger, and I'm not talking about like little cliffhangers. I'm talking about like Viking gore, like crazy stuff I was not expecting. So this is a very intense, very spicy, I will say. I was not expecting there to be like 3 full chapters of spice in this 400-page book. That's not necessarily why I decided to rate this one a 4 though. I think it was just a little bit too predictable in the end, and I don't think it was necessarily insta-lovey, but considering stuff happens like near the middle of the book, and this is going to be a duology, I thought it would be a little bit more of a slow burn. The tension though was really good, I will say that. But what's crazy to me is I've seen people rate this all over the place, from a 3 to a 5 to a 2, and so I really just recommend trying this one out for yourself. And I feel like a lot of people feel the same way I do, where it started off great and amazing, and then it just kind of drops down a little bit at the end, which was really sad. But if you're just wanting something that's Viking, I feel like this is going to be one of my top recommendations now. I went on a huge thriller kick in the month of March, and that is definitely carrying over into the month of April because I'm currently vlogging thrillers. Honestly, I'm just having the best time ever with thrillers, and I did not predict that for this year. I thought this year was going to be like just a full-on fantasy, and then here I am about to share with you 4 thrillers when I only read 2 fantasy books. All of these books I did vlog, so you've probably heard my thoughts on them before, but a new to me author that I cannot get enough of is Frida McFadden. Honestly, are we surprised? Not really, because I have heard so much about this author, and the first book I knew I had to read was The Housemaid because this one I think has the most ratings. This book was wild from start to finish. I ended up rating it a 4.5. For whatever reason, it wasn't quite a 5 because it doesn't match up to some of my all-time favorites, but it's definitely up there now, and it's so weird for me to say I loved a domestic mystery thriller. Usually I'm more of like a psychological thriller person, but this was just so good. Like, Frida knows how to make you feel sympathetic and relate to some of her characters, and typically with thrillers you don't get that. You just are there for the plot and the thrills and the fun time. But with this book, I actually felt for some of these people. Basically, you have our main character who is living out of her car. She recently got out of jail. We don't really know why, but she ends up applying for this housemaid job for Nina Winchester, who's this kind of rich, posh lady. So she honestly doesn't think she has much of a chance because she doesn't quite fit in with that, obviously. But she ends up getting the job. But the first thing she notices that's very suspicious is they end up putting her in a room that looks completely different from the rest of the house. There's also a lock on the outside, and the room is dirty. There's like one shelf and a bed, and it's just really odd. But because she needs the money, of course she's gonna stay and stick it out. So she knows something weird is up, and she decides to try to figure out what in the world this family is about and get to know them, and she gets to know them all right. So I'm just gonna leave it at that. But if you haven't read Frida McFadden before, definitely start with this one. I feel like it is going to be her strongest book. It also gives you a really good taste into a well-rounded thriller of gore and secrets and multiple perspectives. There's just so many things about this book that I really loved. So I'm excited to see what number 2 and 3 has in store, because obviously we follow the same main character from this book, and she ends up being housemates for different families, and it just sounds like a lot of juicy secrets ahead. So because I loved this one so incredibly much, I almost immediately picked up Ward D, and I picked this one up because I love settings that take place at a psychiatric ward. If there's a book that has a medical type of undertone, like The Silent Patient or books like that, immediately I'm intrigued, and I don't know what it is, but I just get sucked into those types of stories. This one is about a medical student named Amy who is assigned to this Ward D. She is supposed to stay overnight, and her ex-boyfriend shows up, which was kind of an interesting dynamic, but the two of them are assigned to study some of the patients and interview them and take notes as part of their schooling. She notices there's a specific room where someone is locked that you can't see inside. There's weird sounds coming from it, and there's just all sorts of crazy things happening with these characters. Not only that, but we actually get a storyline back in time when she was in high school with her friend Jade that ends up tying into the present day, which honestly was my favorite part. I love a good friendship dynamic. I ended up rating this book 3 stars though, because as much as I enjoyed it and ate it up in less than 2 days, there was something just a little bit gimmicky about it to me. It didn't quite feel very realistic, and I wanted just a little bit more from it. But I will say it's the perfect popcorn thriller. You're dying to know what's going on in this ward the entire time, and I did predict a little bit of what was happening. It was a little bit more predictable than The Housemaid, but I still really enjoyed it. If you like those types of medical settings or hospital settings or whatever it is like I do, a lot of people end up liking this one, so I would definitely give this one a try. The same reason why I picked up Ward D is why I decided to pick up The Clinic by Kate Quinn. This takes place at a remote rehab facility for drug addicts, and our main character's sister, who I believe was a popular or famous like country singer, she ends up at this rehab facility, but she ends up dying. So her sister Meg ends up going undercover to this facility and trying to figure out who her sister's killer is. I don't want to say any more than that, but I will say I don't know what to rate this still. I'm kind of undecided. I think I want to rate it 2 stars, which is really disappointing for me because this is one of my most anticipated thrillers of the year. But first of all, this book was pushing 450 pages for a thriller, and for me that is just way too long. I struggled so hard to get through this, even though the chapters were incredibly short and we bounced back and forth between 2 perspectives. Something about this was just so incredibly slow. If I want a thriller, I want it fast. And the reason I'm rating this 2 stars is not because it's bad, and I do understand that the author wrote this story from her perspective going into a rehab facility herself, but I didn't like any of the side characters. I didn't like the main character. They're basically all unlikable characters. The writing was just mediocre, and I just feel like this isn't a book that I would necessarily recommend. There's also a few trigger warnings in this book, so I would definitely look that up, and I feel like overall this book was just really depressing. It was really depressing. It was too slow, didn't like any of the characters, and I don't know, I just felt okay about it. I was hoping to get like Shutter Island vibes from this, especially because of the cover, and I got none of that. Like, I could not picture this place. The setting was just lost. I was picturing something a little more eerie. So if you are a beginner to thrillers, you could definitely check this one out, but I feel like it did a lot of things that I've read in other thrillers, so I just wasn't surprised or really all that impressed with this one. And the last thriller I read for a vlog is The Villa by Rachel Hawkins. I have read Rachel Hawkins in the past before. I think I read Reckless Girls and I hated it. I think I gave it 2 stars, so I was very nervous going into this one, but everyone was saying this one and The Heirs is like her best yet, and what really pulled me into wanting to read this one is there are Mary Shelley vibes and also Fleetwood Mac, and I was like, okay, I feel like I could be more into this one than Reckless Girls. I did end up giving this one a 3.5 though. There was just a lot of tropes and settings and vibes in this one that I really like as a reader. This book is basically about two friends named Emily and Chess who grew up together, and they were both aspiring writers. They said one day they would write a book together, but then they end up going their separate ways. One is a cozy mystery writer and the other is like a motivational nonfiction writer. Emily unfortunately is going through a terrible breakup, and Chess decides, hey, why don't we go on a trip to Italy? We could go to this villa and it will be the perfect break that you need. You can write there, you can be inspired there, and let's just go to get a change of pace. But they didn't realize that they were staying at the villa where a very popular, famous 70s singer was murdered. Emily ends up finding this book and realizing that Mary, who has ties with this famous singer or this band, she realizes that she is one of the most famous horror novelists of the time. And so she is drawing inspiration from things that she finds from Mary. So that's where we have the Mary Shelley vibes that kind of come in. And this was just a very interesting combination. You have like a horror novelist, but you also have a friendship dynamic, but it's set like in this beautiful town in Italy. So it was just a really interesting mix, which I really loved. I can also say that if you love Daisy Jones, I feel like this would 100% be a thriller that you could get on board with. It's more character driven, and I will say I thought I had everything predicted up until the very end. So I was very pleasantly surprised because the whole way through I was thinking I was going to rate this a 3, but by the end with the plot twist I ended up rating it 3.5. So I'm very glad that I gave her a second chance, and I feel like I will probably read The Heiress now. The next book that I read is a romance book called My Lucky Charm by Courtney Walsh, and let me just start off by saying if you have never read a Courtney Walsh book, please read a Courtney Walsh book. If you are a romance reader, or even if you're not, Courtney is one of the people that actually made me love romance. This is obviously a hockey romance, which to me, I'm not super into sports romances. Like I don't pick up a romance just because there's sports in it, but because this is Courtney Walsh and it also follows a character from My Phony Valentine, which is the first one, which I highly recommend reading that first one first because I think that's like my favorite of hers so far. This is about a grumpy Grayson Hawk who gets moved to a different hockey team. He moves to Chicago and he ends up needing an assistant, which ends up being Eloise. It's not a job at all that she was expecting, but obviously the two of them get a little bit close, and I was not expecting the plot twist halfway through this. I don't know how I didn't see it coming, but that just made this book even more sweet. I was feeling okay about it in the beginning, but once I was halfway through and we hit that point, I was like, yep, 5-star. I related to our main character Eloise so much in this book. She's a perfectionist. She also is someone that feels like she's not enough for people, including her friends and her family, and Gray, who she's obviously falling in love with, and I just related to her on so many different levels. Courtney Walsh writes the most relatable female characters. Like I said, if you've never picked up any of her books before, please start here. They are just the sweetest, most wholesome, clean romances that always have the best, happiest endings. And now for the new manga series that I started, we have Cat and Gamer Volume 1. This cat looks super cute, but also kind of super creepy. But this is basically a manga about a girl who's very introverted. She supposedly never works overtime. She's one of those people that is the biggest homebody. She always rushes home every single day to game. She's like the biggest nerd. But one day someone at her office finds a kitten in the parking lot. She doesn't know what came over her, but she volunteers to take this cat in, even though she's never had an animal in her entire life. So as you can imagine, it's so funny to see her study this cat and try to come up with a name and also freak out about fleas. She even compares certain things about this cat to video games, like we're going on a quest to the vet, or this toy is your sword. Little things like that make this so geeky, but also so hilarious. I feel like any cat owner needs to read this because at the end of each chapter, we have a bonus chapter of everything that just happened from that chapter, but from the cat's perspective. So you kind of get inside the cat's head and see what the cat is thinking. And I also love the fact that this was inspired by the author's tuxedo cat. I just thought that was so cute and adorable. So if you are looking for a brand new manga series and one that is just really easy to understand, again, it's not hardcore fantasy or anything like that, it's just a cute little slice of life, I definitely recommend trying this one. I did end up giving this one 4 stars, not because there was anything wrong with it, but I just don't think it's gonna be like a favorite of all time next to like Witch Hat Atelier or Freyrin, but this was really enjoyable and I will probably continue on with the series. Last but not least, I finally found a graphic novel that I've had my eye on for quite some time now, but it was actually at my Barnes & Noble for once, so obviously I couldn't say no, and I finally read Elle or Elle's The New Girl, which is part of a graphic novel series. This is kind of more of a character study about a girl named Elle who moves to this town to a new school. She's slowly trying to make friends, but there's a specific friend that catches on to the fact that she has major mood swings. She really feels for Elle, and she just wants to be there for her as a friend and try to get closer to her, to learn more about her, and just really be there as a friend for her. It's never specifically said outright in this book, but it's basically following a girl with multiple personality disorder, which I thought was a very interesting topic to explore in a graphic novel specifically because it's such a complex thing. But obviously from the cover and the artwork, you can tell that her different personalities come out with different hair colors. Honestly, the artwork in this was just absolutely stunning. I think that's probably my favorite part about this, but also this story was just incredibly unique, and I love the way it was told and the way it was represented, so I ended up giving this one 5 stars. I will say though, there's some type of plot twist or cliffhanger near the end, and because of the way that it is explored in volume 2, I've seen people rate it lower, which makes me a little bit nervous, but I know for sure there's going to be 3 volumes, and I hope to read them all and see how the story goes. So yeah, I was fairly shocked that I rated this 5 stars. So there you have it, friends. Those are all the 9 books that I read in the month of March. I feel like I was reading pretty slowly, but when I finally got to the end of the month, I finally caught up. I don't know if I read any new favorites of the year so far, except for maybe The Housemaid. Frida McFadden was probably the best thing that came out of my March. But if you have read any of these books before, definitely let me know what you thought of them. Let me know in the comments before you leave what your favorite book of the month of March was. Thank you guys for clicking on this video and supporting my channel. I love you guys so much, and I will see you in my next video.